the American people that, in fact, that there would be justice visited upon the terrorists and any nation that may harbor them. And he then also praised the American people as they came together to help heal the wounds of this long and difficult day. Let's go back to NBC's Robert Hager now, who is at the FAA, and talk about where we go from here with the National Transportation Safety Board and the investigations that are already underway. I would guess that one of the first orders of business would be to recover the black boxes, the cockpit voice recording devices, to find out what in fact happened in those cockpits, Robert.
Absolutely. Now, normally the National Transportation Safety Board doesn't get involved in incidents that are obvious acts of terrorism like this, because they investigate the things that more often cause crashes, pilot error and mechanical errors, things like that. So usually they just turn it over to the FBI. But in this case, those black boxes could be crucial, particularly the cockpit voice recorder, because that picks up all the sounds in the cockpit. So we're told that NTSB experts are already on scene now, working very much in cooperation with the FBI in search of those black boxes, particularly the cockpit voice recorders. Now, you know, those boxes are designed to withstand tremendous forces. These were indeed tremendous forces, the way these planes went in. Nothing, sometimes a plane goes in prior to hitting an airport runway and goes in at kind of an angle, and the forces aren't nearly what these are, but smacking right into that Trade Center building like that, or in the case of Pittsburgh, nosing it at a steep angle into the ground, that's a lot to expect of that box, but it may very well be that the cockpit voice recorders have survived that. So now we've been told that NTSB investigators are on site in Pennsylvania and in New York City around the World Trade Center, and right here in their backyard in Washington around the Pentagon, to see if they can find that cockpit voice recorder.
And Robert, I think you were the one who told us earlier today that an air traffic controller in New Hampshire did pick up a fragment of a radio transmission from the first flight, the American Airlines Flight 11 that left Boston.
It's an unconfirmed report, but that report says that the pilot had his microphone keyed, it's called. In other words, he left his thumb down on the microphone so that it was on, and that it picked up the voice of a terrorist in English saying, do this and you won't get hurt, don't expect any trouble, or something like that. And then the microphone went dead. And then the transponders, I think the transponders in all these planes were turned off. So obviously these people knew a lot about what they were doing. And the transponder sends a signal to the radar in the far-off air traffic control centers and tells them what plane a particular blip represents and what altitudes it's at. So without that transponder, the primary transponder, the controllers would have been able to see a blip, but they no longer would have known what altitude the planes were at. So they're watching this blip, they're seeing the plane off course, they have an idea that it's been hijacked, but there's nothing they can do about it.
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. Well, security officials at Logan Airport in Boston will be getting a thorough shakedown tomorrow, because two of the planes originated from there. Those are the planes that went into the World Trade Center, and apparently the terrorists were able to board those planes with whatever weapons they had. There's one report that some of them may have been armed with knives, but two of the flights did originate in Boston. They were able to divert those California-bound flights, turning left shortly after takeoff and coming directly down to the World Trade Center. One left from Newark, that went into the ground outside of Pittsburgh, and of course the other one left from Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. It was headed for Los Angeles as well. It was turned around, it flew low over the capital city, and then it went like a bullet into the side of the Pentagon about 40 minutes after the original attack on the World Trade Center. We've asked Dateline's Lee Thompson to take us through the current state of airline and airport security and where it may go from here.
For years now, one of the primary focuses of aviation security has been to prevent terrorists from smuggling bombs onto our planes. But what was never fully anticipated was that the planes themselves would become the bombs, guided missiles in the hands of the terrorists.
It was a jet. I couldn't believe my eyes.
The agency charged with spearheading airport security and safeguarding the skies, the Federal Aviation Administration. Now, after the most devastating terrorist attack in U.S. history, The FAA, often criticized for lax enforcement and bureaucratic bungling, is itself under siege.
The FAA has blood on its hands because it's not doing its job and hasn't been.
Michael Boyd is an independent aviation consultant with commercial airlines among his clients.
We have a major security problem, obviously, and the FAA is in the middle of it. We've known this for years. I've said it for years, that to a trained terrorist, our airports look like a laundromat. You can get in and get out.
Along with each commercial airline disaster have come new revelations of serious failures by the FAA. Perhaps none more frightening than the multitude of security lapses.
Asking grandma whether she's packed her own bag isn't security when whole perimeters of airports look like sieves.
1988, Lockerbie, Scotland. A terrorist bomb blows Pan Am Flight 103 out of the sky. The aftermath brought both recriminations and recommendations. Our government assured us airport security would be beefed up. Additional security personnel were hired, metal detectors, X-ray machines, and most recently, bomb detection technology. All were deployed to combat the threat of terrorism. But time and time again, in the 12 years since Lockerbie, gaping holes in security have been exposed. Holes the FAA pledged to fix. Holes that government reports warned still remained. Holes that were likely exploited by these terrorists today. There appears to have been a total breakdown at least 3 airports in this country. Give us the scenario of what might have happened.
Well, there are 2 plausible scenarios. Either someone was able to get through the security side at those airports, or maybe even more likely, people working on the ground crews had been compromised.
How easy is it, and tell us the plain truth, to get a gun or a bomb on an airplane?
There are always some airports that fail when we try to get a gun or a knife on an aircraft.
How easy is it to get a job as a security screener?
It is as easy as falling off the proverbial turnip truck to get a job as a security screener. We have people that would be flipping hamburgers if they weren't working in the security function. They're not very well skilled, there's very high turnover, and I'm not sure that they're up to the job.
But inadequate screening of passengers and baggage is not the only threat to security.
We don't screen the people who work at airports properly. At tests that have been done at airports around the United States, we found a large percentage of, or certainly a large number of illegal immigrants, people whose background that we really couldn't check out.
In fact, as Dateline reported in 1996, our producers applied for and were given jobs at 2 of the biggest airports in the country. At Newark Airport in New Jersey, where one of the hijacked planes departed this morning, our undercover producer was hired on the spot, no questions asked, and no job references checked to drive this electric car. But within 2 days, he was working security, checking carry-on bags. He was given no training. And watch how our undercover producer wanders along tarmacs and throughout airplanes without the ID to be there. And he passes some 10 other airport employees without being stopped. At Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, our producer was hired as a baggage handler without the required background check. Again, he was free to roam on airliners like this one. After Dateline's broadcast, the FAA did change policy to try to prevent these types of security breaches, but recent government reports indicate problems persist. This year, the General Accounting Office warned security screeners at U.S. airports continue to miss as many as 20% of weapons smuggled in carry-on luggage during FAA-sponsored tests, and that FAA plans to improve hiring, training, and supervision of security screeners, including the companies that provide them, are woefully behind, in some cases up to 2 years. It's too early to say whether the terrorists gained access to the planes today because of poor security checks or someone working on the inside. But this much is clear. The hijackings were well planned and the terrorists highly trained. Once on board, they knew exactly what to do. Experts say once airborne, there was little the crew could have done to fend off the attackers.
Once on board the aircraft, it would not at all be difficult to gain access to the cockpit. Cockpit door is not like the vault door in a bank, for example. They're rather fragile. You can kick them in if you had to.
Barry Schiff is a retired commercial pilot for a major airline who flew both Boeing 757s and Boeing 767s, the same kinds of jets involved in today's attack.
Pilots go in and out of the cockpit as they need to go to the restrooms. Coffee is brought to them, so the door is opening every once in a while anyway. And even if the cockpit door were locked and nobody were going in or out, it would not be difficult to threaten a flight attendant such that she would get the pilots to open the door because of fear for her life.
Though pilots are trained to handle hijackings, Schiff says historically they don't usually result in fatalities, much less the downing of an airliner.
In most cases, a hijacking is not a dangerous situation. Most hijackings are easily resolved. There's very little a pilot can do if an armed hijacker comes into the cockpit. In most cases, he'll believe that a hijacking is going to end peacefully. In most cases, they normally do. He would have no idea that his aircraft were going to be used as a missile.
Commercial pilots do have the ability to push a button to communicate to air traffic controllers that their plane has been hijacked. But apparently none of the pilots this morning even had a chance to send the signal.
If one had to speculate, I would say the terrorists were flying the aircraft, not the airline pilots who should have been flying the airplane. Mainly because I don't believe any airline pilot would intentionally fly into the World Trade Center, even with a gun at his head.
We may never know exactly what happened in the cockpits, but both the FAA and the airlines had to have known that something was terribly amiss as each of the planes veered inexplicably off their flight paths. What you are looking at is the actual radar tracking of the two flights that left Boston's Logan Airport this morning. American flight number 11, shown here is the blue plane, takes off first. United Flight 175 takes off next. Both proceed west towards Los Angeles. They are fully fueled for a transcontinental trip. Then, somewhere near New York State, the planes abruptly change direction, now flying southeast to Ground Zero, the tip of Manhattan. American Flight 11 finds its target first, Tower number 1. 21 minutes later, American Flight 175, in red, flies south of Manhattan, then makes a sharp turn to the north, where its final chilling moments aloft were captured on videotape. Meanwhile, United Airlines Flight 93 leaves Newark Airport in New Jersey for San Francisco. The radar shows that somewhere near Cleveland, the plane makes a sudden U-turn, then disappears. It crashed in this field near Pittsburgh. Its final destination unknown, but experts suspect that it was likely headed to a target in Washington, D.C.
Since the airplane crashed in a rural area, that there might have been a struggle on board that aircraft between the crew and the hijackers, and that the crew somehow managed to thwart the hijackers' intent of crashing that airplane into something else.
If that's true, the crew probably saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives on the ground. Unfortunately, even their heroics will not be enough to save the aviation system upon which America relies so heavily.
A linchpin of our economy is our air transportation system. We can't do without it. It's not an accessory. As of today, that linchpin has been shut down. In the coming months, what we're going to find is an air transportation system that's totally different than we've known. It's going to be one where airports are going to be basically armed camps.
Providing safe and secure passage for the 640 million passengers passing through 1,000 screening checkpoints, traveling with more than 2.5 billion pieces of carry-on and checked luggage, flying on 97 air carriers is a monumental task that will likely take years to manage.
That's Dateline's Lee Thompson tonight on the state of airport security in this country and airline security. Some very sharp critics in there. It will get much tougher in the days immediately following this terrorist attack and for months and probably for years to come as well. The mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, has appeared to give us an update on the toll of casualties in the World Trade Center attack and the collapse of those 110-story skyscrapers and also 7 World Trade Center, the 40-story building that came down later. Here is some of what he had to say this evening.
At the scene, it's a horrific sight. but there are thousands and thousands of emergency workers down there. We've gotten a tremendous amount of help and assistance. In fact, we actually probably have more equipment than we need at this point. We're very grateful for it, and it'll be stored in areas, and probably over the next 2 or 3 days we will need it. And we'll do everything we can to support the efforts of the people who are trying to recover people from the debris and the horror that's taken place down there. The number to call if you have questions. I'm not sure we can answer all of your questions, but at least we can try to answer it, is 1-212-560-2730. That's 1-212-560-2730. If you have questions throughout the night and tomorrow, that's the number to call rather than 911, which you should just call if there is an emergency. We had over 1,100 emergency room visits today that we know of. So far, we have 6 fatalities that we know of, 5 at St. Vincent's. Obviously and tragically, there are going to be a lot more than that, but that's what we know of at this point. We had over 300 patients that were treated at St. Vincent's, over 160 at Bellevue, 250 at Beekman Downtown Hospital. And the hospital, these hospitals were probably the ones under the most stress, but they were able to get through. I want to thank all of the people that helped St. Vincent's getting the water that they needed and the support that they needed. Also, I'd like to say to people that might consider doing this that services should be made available in New York City tomorrow on a fair and equitable basis. Anybody that thinks that they're going to gouge consumers or ask for extra amounts of money for food or anything else, we're going to have the police and the Consumer Affairs Department out there. So just be careful. This is a time in which we all have to cooperate and help each other. Alternate side street parking is suspended. Sanitation services will take place in most of the city, except obviously in the lower part of Manhattan, where the sanitation department will be working to remove debris, which has already started. And the schools, again, will be closed tomorrow. And hopefully we'll get them open as soon as possible. Tomorrow the effort will be at trying to recover as many people as possible and trying to clean up the horrible mess that was created by all of this. And I would ask people to cooperate as much as possible in that effort. If you have to come into Manhattan because your business is essential, then obviously do it. The upper part of Manhattan will be open. But if tomorrow is a day in which you want to stay home and stay with your family and give comfort and support maybe to other people that have been affected by this, it would be a good day to do that.
Mayor Rudy Giuliani, ironically, this was to be the day in which there was going to be a mayoral primary to try to determine the candidates who would be replacing him. His term limits are up. He's been at once an extraordinarily popular and effective and controversial mayor in New York City, and obviously he is on top of the job here tonight, and he is saying an exceptional statement: stay home tomorrow, stay out of New York City, the busiest city in the world. But it's a day that the city is going to need to be directing all of its efforts on rescue efforts that are downtown in the World Trade Center area, and a lot of the services simply will not be available. All schools are closed here tomorrow. The financial markets are closed as well. NBC's Dan Abrams is down near where that search and rescue effort is underway, and he's with a New York City police official. Dan?
Well, that's right, Tom. Where I'm standing is sort of the gateway to the rescue effort. Literally lines of police cars, fire trucks, ambulances going down the road here to the Trade Center, which is about half a mile away. I'm joined by Detective Ron Brandt, who's been back there for the last 11 hours. Detective, what have you been doing there and what have you seen?
Just when we first got here, originally we mobilized here and just trying to help out and get people off the streets and just helping wherever we can.
For the last 5 hours, 6 hours, what has the rescue effort been, how's that been going?
Just trying to get to see if there's people around and just trying to call out going into subways and just trying to see if there's anybody, you know, that we can help out.
How would you characterize the scene back there now?
It's words I guess can't describe it. Never seen anything in my 14 years. I've never seen anything like it. quite like it. Hopefully I'll never see anything like it again.
Detective, thank you. Tom, I want to bring in Captain Canner from the Fire Department of New York, who is one of the people who's been back there. Captain, thank you for taking the time. Tell us what you have been doing there. You seem to be covered in soot.
Just I've never seen such carnage. Right now, you have some heavy cranes, payloaders, lifting heavy steel beams and all, and doing search and rescue operations. Quite a bit of devastation over there.
When you say search and rescue operations, what exactly is that involving?
Well, we're looking if there are any survivors. I try and ID what we can, and basically lift some of the heavy building off. As you know, 2 buildings came down and another 60-story building collapsed. It's nothing like you could ever imagine. So we have some big payloaders and cranes, and we're going into that operation. Commissioner's over there. We just walked out now after about 10 hours, and we'll be going back in a little while. So everybody's working very hard and doing the best we can.
Have you found survivors? I mean, a lot of the firefighters are coming out are saying to me, look, this is a recovery effort. Have you been finding them?
No survivors so far. So sad to say, quite a few victims, but no survivors so far. So.
And again, when you say quite a few, can you give us a little bit more specifics about what you've been seeing back there?
You'd have to ask the command post. They have an overall view. We were in small pockets in certain areas doing our searches, so I could, knowing what we found, and I'd really rather not say what type of numbers, but I know the command post would have the overall figures.
Finally, what is the state of the building right now? How would you characterize it?
Non-existent, gone. So both towers and a 60-story building next to it. So totally collapsed into each other.
Okay. Thank you very much, Captain Kenner. We appreciate it. Tom, back to you.
They don't call them New York's finest for nothing. Those are really heroic efforts that are underway tonight in the lower end of Manhattan, and they will go on all through the night as they have all day long. The New York City Firefighters Union saying they believe that they lost at least 200 firemen when those buildings came down, and the toll, as we have been saying repeatedly, I know you may be tired of hearing it, we simply don't know how high it may go. At one point today, the president used the phrase thousands dead. It could very well go into the thousands. 2,400 people were killed when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor 60 years ago this year. This attack on America, this terrorist war in America, could be more consequential in terms of lives lost, and it could be as well consequential in other ways in terms of getting this country involved around the world. Pearl Harbor, of course, triggered World War II, one of the epic events in the history of mankind. This is not expected to do just that, but it will change this country in so many ways. Let's go to Robert Bazell now, who has been at St. Vincent's Hospital for much of the day. It's one of the hospitals that are very near the World Trade Center, first-rate medical facility, and they have been taxed beyond their belief, I would guess. Robert?
Yes, Tom, in the last hour or two, the number of ambulances coming in here has gone down to a trickle, and we understand from hospital officials that's because rescue workers have hit some kind of a hot spot, possibly a gas line or something like that, that's made them have to stop the search and rescue operations. But to get the latest numbers from the hospital, I'm going to bring in Mark Ackerman, who is a deputy administrator of St. Vincent's Hospital. He's been here all day. Mr. Ackerman, you had an emergency plan here in place. You were the lead hospital for the 1993 World Trade explosion. How well were your people prepared today?
Bob, I think we're very well prepared. Unfortunately, St. Vincent's has been in the epicenter of a number of these types of incidents, and we have preparedness drills throughout the year, so we were quite ready.
What are the latest numbers of casualties that you have here now?
St. Vincent's here in Manhattan has received 327 patients thus far. 62 of them are in critical condition.
How are we doing with that?
55 of those individuals are firefighters or police officers, and 3 of our patients have passed away.
Now, that's a lot of casualties, but it's nothing compared to what we thought we would see when we got here this morning.
It's really very upsetting to our entire staff. We really, in the beginning, had been told to expect up to 1,000 patients, and I think the realization is coming to all of our physicians and nurses that we were the hospital that received the most patients, and that really only means that there are still many, many people down under that rubble.
Now, you have some personal tragedies here as well as the people that are coming in. You had a nurse who was communicating with her husband. Tell me that story.
Yeah, one of our nurses in our comprehensive cancer center, husband was up on a very upper floor. She heard about the airplane. She emailed her husband. They were talking back and forth, and then the email stopped, and she found out that the building had collapsed and realized that her husband had gone down with it. So it's a real tragedy from that perspective. A number of our nurses are married to firefighters and police officers, and they've been working hard all day, knowing in the back of their minds that their loved ones may be among the casualties.
There's some terrible stories here, Tom, and I think that we're going to find out that this is going to continue on in the next few days, although certainly not at the rate that we saw it today. And I think from talking to the Dan Abrams, talking to the firefighter officials, we were talking about the magnitude of the rescue efforts, huge steel beams. It is the bodies and the victims, the injured, will continue to come in, but at a much lower rate. Tom?
Ask Mr. Ackerman for us quickly, if you could, Robert, whether they have enough medical personnel, doctors and trained nurses and so on.
Mr. Ackerman, are there enough doctors? Do you have the staff you need to deal with whatever contingencies come up?
We do. We had over 500 physicians and nurses on duty, or people that came in from their days off. There was a convention of physicians in town here. As a matter of fact, we had people from Europe come and offer their assistance. And in fact, ultimately, we ended up turning people away because so many wonderful New Yorkers and people from around the world volunteered their services.
And there was also an amazing sight here today. At one point, the hospital had asked for blood, and the number of donors who were spilling onto the street here was so great, within just minutes of the first announcement, that you had to turn them away.
We did. Actually, we had over 800 people in line at one point. The mayor happened to come at that moment and said, "What do you need?" And we said, "We have people we have to ship to other blood centers." And we had 10 city buses here in a matter of moments. Those 800 people were brought around the city to donate blood in other places.
And you have enough beds to handle all the people that have come in and all the people that will be coming in the next hours?
We do. We have 2,600 beds in the St. Vincent's Catholic Medical Center system, 800 beds here in Manhattan. We were able to send many of our patients to our other hospitals, and they will be ready now with beds here in Manhattan in the event we get many more patients overnight.
Thank you very much, and great job here by many, many doctors and nurses, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, Bob Bazell at St. Vincent's, one of New York's premier hospitals in Lower Manhattan, not too far from the World Trade Center, or what used to be the World Trade Center. You can only imagine what it was like in the nation's capital today. First, the news that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane, then a second plane had hit the other tower. That, of course, conjured up immediate visions of that this was some kind of a terrorist attack. Then the Pentagon was hit by a hijacked airliner. Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was in his office at the time. It penetrated 2 of the rings of that fortress-like building. The fires continue to burn there tonight. There was a code red on Capitol Hill. That meant that House Speaker Dennis Hastert, who was third in line of succession, had to be taken to a secure location. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor to the President, was on the phone to him. He was at a literacy event in Florida, and she told his staff that they then suspected terrorism as a result of the second attack. She went to the operations room in the White House with Vice President Dick Cheney. Colin Powell turned around on a trip to Lima and started back for the United States. What kind of a day was it for the rest of the day in the nation's capital? Here's NBC's Nora O'Donnell with a report on this day that will be remembered for so long, for so many terrible reasons.
Help me get all these people across the street, please.
Moments after the attack on New York, the chaos spread to the nation's capital.
So what looked to be maybe a 20-passenger corporate jet, no markings on the side, coming in at a shallow angle like it was landing right into the side of the Pentagon. And then a huge fireball, perhaps 5 times the height of the Pentagon.
The terrorist target was the nerve center of the United States military. An explosion ripped through the building that since World War II has symbolized America's power.
And we heard this boom, the building shook, the ceiling tiles fell out of the ceiling, and we ran out. We kind of dazed, grabbed our hard hats, ran out, and there was just smoke. People were screaming, "Run, what is it, what is it?"
Let's roll! Get on the other side!
As firefighters rushed to put out the flames, America learned that the Pentagon had indeed taken a direct hit. Not from a corporate jet, but from another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77. en route from Washington's Dulles Airport to Los Angeles. 58 passengers and 6 crew members were aboard. There may have been as many as 100 more people killed or injured inside the building. Dozens were rushed to area hospitals, yet to be accounted for, others that may still be left in the smoldering rubble.
Here in Washington, D.C., we are at threat condition Delta.
Washington, D.C., now in the crosshairs of terrorism. The military was ordered to its highest state of alert. And at the White House, the Secret Service received a credible threat of a terrorist act.
We've got to be off the grounds and inside the building.
A fourth hijacked plane that crashed 80 miles outside Pittsburgh is believed to have been headed for an attack on Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland. The president wasn't in town, but Vice President Cheney was. He and key aides were whisked out of the West Wing and into a secure location, while other White House staffers were evacuated under the watch of Secret Service agents armed with machine guns.
We've had some reports about intrusions of airspace, which caused us to be concerned enough to recess the House of Representatives subject to the call of the chair.
At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the U.S. Capitol and Supreme Court, lawmakers and justices were forced from the seat of American democracy.
I think in a sense it is unfortunately a unique experience in American history.
And I characterize it as a man who lived through World War II as a young sailor at the end of the war. It's another Pearl Harbor for this country.
By 10 a.m., all federal offices were closed, sending the government's entire workforce into the clogged streets to try to make their way home. For tourists, museums and monuments were shut down as well. Washington was in a frenzy. Hospitals in emergency mode, roads shut down, bridges closed, fighter jets patrolling the skies. The mayor declared a state of emergency.
That all of our emergency agencies are fully deployed to meet any emergencies that might arise.
The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow.
Later, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, stepped up to the Pentagon podium to state the horrible truth everyone already knew.
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, massive attack against the United States of America.
What kind of world do we live in? This is terrible. It's just awful.
Tonight, Washington is a ghost town. This is the Memorial Bridge, normally crowded with traffic. Yet the attack has succeeded in shutting down the capital of the United States and left Americans wondering, how could it have happened in this of all cities?
The White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon are symbols of America.
Counterterrorism forecaster Marvin Citron authored a report in 1994 for the Department of Defense, warning of Washington's vulnerability to terrorist attack.
We predicted a plane could have crashed into the Pentagon. That's about as specific as you can be. If you made a right turn at the Washington Monument, you could hit the Pentagon. A left turn, you could hit the White House.
He advised back in 1994 that air traffic be controlled over and around all federal buildings, but he says this recommendation was not implemented.
People are wondering today how the Pentagon, which is the symbol of America's military power, could be hit by a plane. How could that happen?
Because we're a free society. The balance you've got in the United States is access and freedom to complete security.
Despite heightened security after the Oklahoma City bombing and barriers at the White House, Citron says Washington became complacent about protecting itself.
We've let down. We strengthened ourselves during Oklahoma because the crisis was there. We were in a crisis mode. Once we get rid of that mode, we go back to laissez-faire.
But is it even possible to protect Washington, a symbol of democracy, but also the nucleus of the country's power?
You cannot defend against this kind of an attack. The Pentagon is just one more Washington office building. That's all it is. It's not a fortress.
Noel Cook is a former Pentagon counterterrorism chief. Just this June, he authored a report warning that an attack of this kind was imminent. Now he says the nation has to face the reality of terrorism in our own backyard.
What's emotionally gripping is the feeling that this thing has come home to roost in a major way. We are vulnerable in ways that we never were prepared to admit to ourselves, and we're going to have to cope with that.
Marvin Citron concurs. He predicts a city under siege.
I think people are going to be more looking around it'll look more like Israel, where the people there are accustomed to attacks from terrorists, and they're prepared, and they look for things. We'll do more of the same thing.
The first step for now, a show of determination by President Bush, who returned to the White House at the end of a tragic day, hoping to allay the fears of a stunned and terrified nation.
That's Nora O'Donnell, who covers Congress for NBC News and Washington in general. The D.C. Police Chief Charles Ramsey said tonight, nothing in Washington, D.C., your nation's capital, is likely to be the same again. That's the police chief of that city. But as far as security is concerned, there is no longer any such thing, he said, as business as usual. Already Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House had been closed down. There had been some talk about reopening that. That talk will disappear in a heartbeat as a result of this attack on the Pentagon today and the terrorist attack up here in New York City. What goes on in a cockpit when there's the kind of chaos that we witnessed here today? Well, someone who knows a lot about cockpit chaos in a flight that is in a distressed mode is Al Haynes. He was the man who was at the controls of that United Airlines flight in July 1989 and made that heroic controlled crash landing in Sioux City, Iowa, and saved so many lives with his heroic action. Let's talk to you, Mr. Haynes. You were not being hijacked at the time, obviously, but what it must have been like in that cockpit. You had to be thinking about that today as you watched all these images.
Yeah, Tom, I can't imagine what that crew went through. I have to believe, like everybody else has been saying all day, that the crew only had control of the airplane from the very beginning, and after that it had to be someone else. No crew would do what those people did.
Yeah.
What they went through had to be terrible.
And they were obviously very sophisticated, the hijackers, because they knew enough to turn off the transponders so no one could track their flight.
Oh, I hadn't heard that. They did turn the transponder off.
Yes. And if
well, that would be.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. They can track them by the blip, but they would have just a blip to follow, and it'd be very difficult for the controllers, I would think, to follow. Yeah.
What are the procedures in a cockpit if you are being hijacked? How are you trained as a pilot?
Well, you have several different things you can do. One is you do send out a transponder code, but obviously they knew better than that. And that's about it. There's not much else you can do. You send the transponder code, and if they won't let you transmit on the radio, then you're just there, and that's all there is to it.
Is there any other way to send a secret signal to air traffic controllers that you're being hijacked?
Not unless you use a transponder. Other than that, there's really no way to contact them other than by radio. And if they know enough to turn the transponder off, I'm sure they won't let you talk.
Once you get airborne in a 757 or whatever these planes were today, how difficult would it be for someone to remove the pilot from the chair and take the controls and fly it as precisely as they did into the Pentagon and into the World Trade Center?
Well, I would just guess here, speculation, that once they're in the cockpit, they probably know enough to put it on autopilot. They put it on autopilot, then they pull the crew out of the seats by either executing them or making them unconscious, and then they can get back in and fly. But first it would go on autopilot, so the airplane would be under control while they were doing this. And they probably know enough to do that, evidently, if they know enough to turn off the transponder. That'd be a guess anyway.
Yeah, but they made a hard left turn when they left Boston, according to the blip that we were able to follow on the tracking tape, and then they were able to make a couple of banking turns at low altitude here over Manhattan, and I think that there was at least one report that they did the same thing over Washington, D.C., perhaps over Lafayette Park. So it does appear that the people who were at the controls were skilled pilots, and if they were the terrorists, they were obviously highly trained.
Well, it's also possible that they hijacked the airplane before it took off. I'm just, again, a wild guess, so that they were actually in the cockpit at the takeoff. And if you know that the one down in the Caribbean that crashed, the hijacker was in the right seat while the captain was in the left seat. It's possible if he thinks they're just going to hijack the airplane, you'll do whatever they say. And if he says, I'm going to sit in this right seat, you take off, that's what you do because you assume he's just going to go somewhere and land and refuel and that type of thing.
How difficult has this day been for you watching these planes being flown into buildings and the Pentagon?
It was difficult at first, especially when I found out there were crews involved, and when I found it was United, it was even more so. But the whole thing has been very difficult. I have been busy most of the day and haven't seen an awful lot of it, but what I have seen is just, as the word everybody uses, horrific, and it's a very emotional thing for anyone.
Al Haynes, thank you very much for being with us. It still was a marvel of piloting that you did when you landed that plane in Sioux City, Iowa, That a United Airlines plane that had lost most of its controls, and he was able to bring it in a controlled crash landing. They did lose some of the passengers, obviously, but any number of them were saved as a result of his great skills in the cockpit. We want to show you some remarkable scenes now from inside Air Force One. This is the fighter jet escort that Air Force One had as it flew back to Washington today from the Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base. That may become a routine procedure for the president as he flies domestically in this country as well as internationally. It's not always a conspicuous presence. You generally have planes when you're flying with the president over disputed areas that are in the vicinity, but you don't see him flying that closely off the wing of Air Force One. They're on their approach now to Andrews Air Force Base. That's an F-16. I think I can only see one tail sticking up, so I think it's an F-16 that helped escort them back to Andrews Air Force Base. Let's go to Dateline's Keith Morrison, as he has been taking the pulse of this country. America, in all of its complexity and all of its parts, becomes a family on a day like today. Here's Dateline's Keith Morrison.
In a moment, everyone knew things can't be the same anymore. And all across the country, as shock gave way to fear or anger or some other emotion, officials in charge of places and events shut them down. Suddenly, this is a country in which security means everything. Airports almost everywhere closed.
No airplanes will be leaving any of the airports in the United States until the ground stop is lifted.
Hundreds of people at airports all around the country